This is a video where I review how to use a struct in AVRC. A struct is an incredibly powerful construct which allows you to group different data types together under one naming convention and be able to use those together. And so when you have multiple LEDs or multiple motors or multiple of anything, being able to put them into a struct and the controlling variables into a struct and then to be able to reference them together really simplifies your programming code. And that simplification is great because one, it aids maintainability and it eases debugging once you know it works, and it's going to continue to work, and you just add more variations of that multiple. Now there are two ways to address this. One is how a struct helps in code size. And I'm not going to address that in this video. If you want to understand that and the value of that, then I encourage you to take a look at the entry code versus cost. And there's also a video that talks about it and how it has an impact literally on the cost of your projects. And so that's addressing the code versus cost elements of a struct. What I want to do in this particular video is just talk about how to build one and how to use it and how to use it to your advantage. And we'll start that with the blink without delay example. And so this is the one that was referenced in Adafruit and multitasking the Arduino part 1. And it's simply blink without delay. Instead of using a delay in number of milliseconds, we use the clock millis and we check how many milliseconds have elapsed since the last time we've checked. And if that time interval has exceeded our desired interval, which we've got coded right here, then we change the state. And so we check it here. If the current millis minus the previous millis is greater than our interval, then we save the current time. We reset the clock, we flip the state, and then we write that state to the LED, and then we go through it again. Okay, now what we're going to do is we're going to make changes so that those specific variables, LED pin, state, interval, and previous millis, let's now make them part of a struct. And how do we do that? It's pretty simple. You take that same code that you had before without the initialization, and you put it into a struct construct. So you have struct blinker, then you have your bracket, then you got a close bracket, and then you give it a tag of blinker, and then you use that tag, struct blinker, and you create an instance of it. In this case, we're going to call that instance LED. And so, you know, it's very similar to what we did when we had 4 separate variables, except now we use dot notation to reference them. So we say LED, which is this part here, dot first element, LED pin, and then LED state, which is this one here. And then we say LED interval and LED previous millis. And now we're just initializing the same way that we did before. And then we're going to use them. And instead of just saying previous millis, we'll say use dot notation and say LED dot previous millis, LED dot interval, and so on. And so the only thing we've done is it made it a little more complicated because we have to use the dot notation. However, when you take a look and see what it takes to add the second, it's fairly easy to add a second LED. And so what are the things we do? Well, we add another instance. We keep the same struct, but now we just call it LED1. I did change the name to LED to be LED0. And now I've got LED1. So I've got 2 versions of that struct. And I initialize them right here. Here I initialize LED0. And then I initialize LED1. And then I have 2 loops. One that addresses LED0, and then one that addresses LED1. And the only change I made in those 2 sections of code was I just changed the 0 to a 1, and everything else stays the same. So pretty simple copy and paste exercise. And you can see the value of that. Your code size is expanded pretty significantly, but it's pretty understandable. You could add a third LED by just adding one more line here, LED 2, and then duplicating these and changing all the LED 1s to LED 5, and then duplicating this code from LED 1 to LED 2, and so on. So that's how you would add, but the code size increases pretty significantly. So let's make it an array and see how that works. And so now we use the same struct, but when we create it, we give it a size. We say LEDs, and we make it LED, the number of LEDs, which we have defined as 3. And so now we have an LED, a struct array, and we can address them by their index instead of LED 0 with the variable, with the struct name. We go LEDs subscript 0, LED subscript 1, LED subscript 2. And it's a simpler way to reference them. And we do the same thing, except now we can reference them far easier with a for loop, because we can just go through the subscripts and just address them that way. So our control code is simplified a great deal. We've kept these 5 lines the same, or let's see, yeah, these 5 lines the same, but put it into a for loop, counting up to in LEDs, and it's simplified how we can do it. Now, what could we do about simplifying this code? Actually, it's all of this code here. That's still quite a bit of initialization code, and we can create a function that does that for us as well. So we do what we call refactoring. We create a function where we pass it the index and the values that we want to initialize those various variables with, and then we just use the index to figure out which one we want to point to, and then we use the values as our initialization values. And so that means we can have this very simple init function where we just give it the index, the pin number, the initial state, the interval that we want it to blink at, and then we initialize previous to 0, and we can just continue. And so adding additional LEDs is just all we have to do now is increase this number here from 3 to 4 to 5, and then add additional init statements for everyone. And so now the maintainability of this code is relatively simple. It took me less than a minute to add 3 more LEDs by making in LED 6 and then adding 3 more lines for 3 additional LEDs. And all the rest of the code stayed the same. It had already been debugged. I know it works. And that's the value of using a struct inside as an array and being able to address multiple versions of similar devices or in the same fashion.